Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kapeh. We're going to get started at the top of our daf, continuing with items that one needs to, or things that one needs to distance from the city as it affects the inhabitants of the city. So you have to distance dead bodies of animals, cemeteries, and the tannery from the city. Issue is, Rashi says, all these things have foul odors associated with them. Some people say that the cemetery does not have to do with foul odors, but the cemetery has to do with the fact that people will see the cemetery all the time. They come into the city, it'll depress them, and therefore we should keep the cemetery farther away from the city. And the Borski, not only does it have to be distance 50 cubits, but it can only be on the eastern side of the city because the eastern winds are meant to be calmer winds, and not any other wind is going to, and particularly the western winds, are very strong, and they're going to blow the smells right into the city. Rabbi Akiva Omer, really you can do any distance, just not from the west. Umarchik Hamishim Ama. So he says it's not a problem north, south, or east, obviously, but any, right, just not west, and Marchik Hamishim Ama. Okay, so he says north, south, east is totally fine. And one needs to distance 50 cubits. We have to understand this line to what is it referring. North, south, east is okay to do even not within 50 cubits, and west you would have to distance 50 cubits, or does it mean where you can do it though, you still have to distance 50 cubits, it's just you could do it. So we'll get to that in the Gemara. This we saw already on Daf Yomi. You have to distance where you're soaking the flax from vegetables growing, and krishim and abtsalim, and the leeks from the onions, and that's a hardam and advalim, and the mustard seeds from the mustards growing from the bees. Rabbi Yossi matir b'chardal, he permits with the bees. We'll get to that later, why he permits. We already saw it on Daf Yud-Chet. Ibayelu, comes the Gemara and asks the question that I mentioned before. Rabbi Akiva hechi kamar. How do we read Rabbi Akiva? L'chol ruach oseh, you could do any direction, v'somech, and put it right next to the city, meaning north, south, and east, you could go right next to the city. Other than the west, on the west, you'd have to distance it 50 cubits, and then you could do it. Or perhaps we mean any distance you can do it, but you have to distance yourself 50 cubits. In other words, any distance works, any side works as long as you distance it 50 cubits. Other than the west, where you can't do it at all. Tashma. So now we're going to learn from a different source. We'll get to an answer to our question. Titania, Rabbi Akiva Omer, L'chol ruach oser rakik hamishim ama, chutz mima'arava de'eno ose kol ikar mipnei shehi tadira. So now we have a braita which says explicitly what the Mishna wasn't really very clear about. You can do it in any direction, but you have to distance it 50 cubits, other than the west, where you can't do it at all because it's tadira. Tadira is common. What does this mean, tadira? We assume it means the wind commonly comes from the west, and that's the issue. Okay, and we described before that the western wind is the strongest, which may be true, maybe not. We're going to see that perhaps the issue is really something entirely different. Amar Rav Nachman, my tadira. Ilema tadira baruchot, it's the most common wind, which, by the way, doesn't mean it's the strongest. It just means it's going all the time, or the most frequent. Wait, but we have this statement in the name of Rav that says, 4 winds blow every day, and the ruach tzfonit blows with all of them. Meaning, winds blow from all directions throughout the course of the day. But every time the wind blows, the northern wind blows with it. Now that means, if you figure out, right, that means the northern wind is the most frequent wind because it's blowing every time some wind blows, the north wind blows with it. Now, why does the north wind blow with all the other winds? We're going to see right now that it's a calming wind and it tempers the other winds. Because if it weren't for that, the world wouldn't survive even 1 hour. And again, what we're going to say is the winds are very strong. Here it says it's the south wind that's the worst. And the north wind basically calms all these winds down. Now, how do we know that the south wind is the worst? Okay, you're going to see different statements about the winds, and it seems that there were different opinions about which wind was actually the worst or not. and some of them are going to contradict each other. Some of them will deal with it. It's not so clear, all these things about the winds. We're going to have a bit of an off the track kind of daf. We're going to get into all sorts of things about how the sun goes around the earth, okay, which we know not to be the case, but the Gemara had their way of, they were under the Ptolemaic view, Ptolemy and his view about how the world worked. And how, the earth is the center, the sun goes around the earth, and we're going to discuss how this works and some issues that they were trying to grapple with that they kind of saw and tried to figure out how this is. Bit of a strange type of sugya, not your typical sugya, although we have seen things like this before. But we're not there yet. So now we're getting off all about the winds. So first we want to understand what Rabbi Akiva said when he said the west wind is tadira. It can't be common because of the statement. Now we're in the middle of the statement. Ruach Dromid is the hardest, the most difficult of all the winds. And again, the north wind tempers that wind and all the other winds. If it weren't for Ben Netz, which was an angel that would calm down, that apparently appeared as the north wind, or appeared in the north wind, and it stopped the south wind. If it didn't stop the south wind, it would have destroyed the world. Shenemal, how do we know this? From a pasuk in Eov. In Eov, pasuk that says, God is talking to Eov and says, what, you think you did all this? Hami binatcha, from your intelligence, yevar netz, yifros knafav l'teman. What, you think it's all because of you that the netz came and spread its wings to Teman? Now, Teman is from Yamin, which is right, but which is understood to be a reference to the south. Okay, the Yama, Temana, Tzafona, Venegba. Okay, the Teman is often considered a direction of south. Elamai Tadira. So now they say, okay, it can't be that basically because the north wind is going to basically save the south. And there you see the north is the most common wind because it's always out there. And that was really where we got to this from. So Elamai Tadira b'Shechina. Now we're going to see that the Shechina is in the west. This is an interesting thing. We're going to have a whole discussion. We're going to have, perhaps we could count them as 5. This could be a little bit difficult question. You'll see my deliberations about how many opinions really there are about this and how to count them. But let's suggest right now we'll have a maximum of 5 different approaches to where the divine presence exists in the world. So basically what they're going to say is don't put the tannery on the west because that's where the divine presence is. And that's disgusting to put something smelly and with a foul odor in the west where God's presence is. Okay, how do we know that the Shechina is in the west? The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Bo benachzik tova l'avotenu, shehudiu makom tefillah. Let's be thankful to our forefathers that they told us how to pray. Dichtiv, as it says. Okay, this is a verse from Nehemiah, and that must be who we're talking about, Avotenu, to Ezra Nehemiah, perhaps the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, some people explain. It says, Utzva hashamayim lecha mishtachavim. The heavens bow to you. Now, the heavens bow to God. Where does that put God? Well, let's think if the stars and the moon and the sun, okay, now, the sun, basically being the main one, rises in the east. So when it rises in the east, and then it keeps rising, it faces toward the west. So that must be that God is in the west, because the sun is basically rising from the east, facing toward west, and therefore bowing toward God. Wait a minute. That doesn't prove anything. And perhaps he's suggesting an alternative reading, and he's suggesting an alternative reading of this pasuk, which is if they're bowing, you assume the sun is facing toward God. But often if the sun is leaving from God, maybe it's a better way to say it. God's in the east. Sun rises every morning, and the sun backs over to the west without turning away from God, like the way people leave the kotel and they try not to turn around. Right? So maybe it's that. Now, whether he thinks that really that means God's presence is in the east, or he's just playing devil's advocate here and saying that pasuk doesn't prove anything. So that's why I'm not sure how to count whether this counts as the second one, or perhaps it's really just knocking out of the first one. But let's perhaps say maybe there's 2. God is in the west or God is in the east, and the divine presence of God. Okay. Yeah. Right. They give it as an example of an Eved that gets a present from his master. and therefore, backs away from his master as a sign of respect, doesn't turn his back to the master. Kasha. So in fact, this is a good difficulty against Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Now we're going to move to a third approach, okay, either second or third. Rabbi Yoshai Saval Shechina B'chol Makom. The divine presence is everywhere. This song I grew up on, maybe some of you also, right? Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, right? Up, up, down, down, right, left, all around. God is everywhere. Okay, there is no unique place of God. To Amar Rabbi Yoshai, Mai Daftiv Atau Hashem Levadecha, Ata Asita Et HaShamayim and Shemei HaShamayim. Okay, you are God. You are singular. No one is like you. You created the heavens, and it talks about all those kind of things up in the heavens. So now they use this as a reference to God's messengers. And it says, God, how are you different from anyone else? Well, shluchecha lo k'shluchei basar v'dam. Your messengers are not like messengers that humans send out. Shluchei basar v'dam mimakom shemishtachim mimakom shemishtachim l'sham machzirim shlikutan. One of the definitions of a messenger is that the messenger goes out, delivers a message, comes back or does an action for the person who sent the messenger, and then comes back and tells the person, I fulfilled the mission. This came up in a sugya in Gittin, by the way, it was a whole thing about a woman being able to deliver. I forget exactly the details, but there was this problem that she couldn't go back and report that the agency was done. Forget exactly what the context was, but there was definitely a sugya there that talked about this. And that is, and there it was like, where do we get this from? And actually, it's also mentioned in this sugya that it's part of what agency is. But so you go, like let's say I go from New York to California to take care of something for someone, and then I go back to New York and I say I took care of it. Right, nowadays you might send a WhatsApp, but in those days there wasn't. But it's the place that you go to. From there you can report to God that you did your message, because if these angels that God sends, or any kind of whatever we call God's messengers, they go do something, and then they stay there because they could just tell God there, I did it, because God is everywhere. And that's the uniqueness of God. So now they say, right, and there you see, God's presence is everywhere. That was this proof, and we're going to prove it from a pasuk, Shenemal, besides this Hashem Levadecha, which just said God is singular. In what way was he singular? But how do we know that in this way God is singular? Shenemar, again, a pasuk from Eov, where again God is saying, what, do you do this? Meaning, these are the things I do. Hatishlach brakim vayalech, or you sending messages and they will go. V'yomru lecha hineni, and then they'll tell you that we're here. Meaning they'll tell you they did their message, their agent, what you sent them to do. Yavo v'yomru lo ne'amar. It doesn't say they will come back and tell you. It says vayelechu vayomru. They will go and tell you. Meaning they didn't have to come back because God's presence is everywhere. Melamed shashchina b'chol makom. Okay, there we learn the divine presence is everywhere. V'af Rabbi Yishmael Savar. Not only Rabbi Yoshai says this, we're going to see three people who said this. That Savar he held, also Rabbi Yishmael, which by the way makes sense. He disagrees with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said on the west you can't put the tannery, and we explained, right, and Rabbi Akiva says because it's tadir, and we explained tadir was because God's presence is in the west. So Rabbi Akiva thinks, like Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, that God's presence is in the west. Whereas the Rabbi Yoshai, we're going to see Rabbi Yishmael, who always argues with Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to see Rav Sheshet, all think God's presence is everywhere. How do we know this? Titana, it says in Titana debei Rabbi Yishmael, in a braita from the house of Rabbi Yishmael, it says, Minayin sheshchina b'chol makom. How do we know God's presence is everywhere? Shenemal. Now we're going to quote a nevuah from Zechariah. Zechariah sees an angel who tells him, go measure, because we're going to start building the walls of Jerusalem. And as soon as that angel leaves, another angel comes and says, Jerusalem will not be surrounded by walls. It will be open. So he has these contradictory testimonies that come to him to different angels. And let's see how the angels appear to him. Shenema. So the braita starts off, how do we know the Shekhinah is everywhere? Shenemar, hine hamalach hadover bi. The malach who was speaking to me, Yotze, goes out. He's describing the vision he saw. Malach achir Yotze the krato, and there's another angel going to greet that angel. Now, if one angel comes from the left and is talking to Zechariah, and another angel comes to greet him, that means he's coming likrato. It doesn't mean, maybe it's a bad translation. Likrato means coming opposite him, meaning coming from a different direction. Now, if God is dispatching messengers, Wouldn't you think God would dispatch them from where God is? If God's in the same place, then the messengers should be all going in the same direction. So they say, Acharav lo ne'amar. It doesn't say, and another angel came after that first angel, but it says, umalach acher, right? Ela likchato, but it said coming toward him. Melamed sheshchina b'chol makom. From there, you know God's presence is everywhere. God can send an angel from one place. God can send an angel from another place. And like I said, Af Rav Sheshet savar shchina b'chol makom. Also, Rav Sheshet said the divine presence is everywhere. First of all, Rav Sheshet was blind, which is interesting because you can imagine he must feel God's presence. Now, none of us see God's presence anyway, but maybe he had a better sense of it. But really, I'm just saying that. But the reason I pointed out he's blind is because he said to his shamash, the person who was serving him, because he needed the shamash to do this, because he couldn't tell directions, he couldn't see. So Amar le Rav Sheshet l'shameh, he said to his shamash, the person who was helping him, L'chol ruchacha ukman chutz mimizrach. Set me up to pray facing any direction, just not east. Which might sound strange to you, because many people, right, if you're in certain parts of the world, which are many parts of the world where people are living, they face east because that's east toward Israel. Set me up in any direction other than Mizrach, other than the east. And not, by the way, because God's presence isn't there, because Rosh Hashanah agrees that divine presence is everywhere. There's a different reason why he didn't want to be facing east, and what's that? And because the heretics pray to the east, and those are the people who thought that the God was the sun was God. And therefore, if the sun rises in the east, so people would pray to the sun and where the sun rose from to the east. So he didn't want people praying that way because it would look like they were a heretic. But Rabbi Yavau amar shchina b'ma'arav. Now Rabbi Yavau goes back and says what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Akiva said, which is the shchina is in the west. To Amar Rabbi Yavau, my Oriya is short for Avir Ya. Okay, it's the air of God, which means basically that's where God is. Now, how does Avira connect with west? So Rashi said in Persian, the word Avira meant west, and they were darshaning the Persian language with Hebrew drasha, basically, which is a strange thing to do. There's different explanations offered. Some people think this isn't talking about the west. Anyway, I'll leave that. What we have so far, and we're not finished with this topic, but we are going to veer from it momentarily. We have this idea. We started with the west is where God's presence is, and that's why you can't put the tannery in the west, and that explains Rabbi Akiva. But there were other opinions about where God's presence is, most of them saying that God's presence is in the anywhere, and it's not in any one particular place. How this relates to davening, we're going to have to get back to when we end this sugya on the next side of the page. We'll come full circle and come back to, well, aren't we supposed to daven toward Jerusalem? And if God's presence is everywhere, why do we need to? And you see Rav Sheshet even davened in any direction. So the whole thing we learned in Brachot about where to face seems to somewhat go against this Gemara. We will get back to that. Tosfot raises this problem on our daf in the Dibur Matchil L'chol Ruchacha Ukman, and basically says, maybe I'll even start here, Kol Hani Amora'e late Lihu Hadatan de Brachot. These Amoraim clearly didn't hold by what it said in Brachot, Shechayav Adam Litpalel Neged Yerushalayim, that you have to face Jerusalem. Okay, and the quote there in Brachot, he quotes is the pasuk in Sefer Melachim when Shlomo does the dedication in the temple, and he says, everyone will pray through this land. So they say that all these people held like Rabbi Ishmael, that God's presence is everywhere. And if you say it's in the Ma'arav, right, that's like Rabbi Akiva, and that there seem to be these different positions. And we'll only get later, he quotes Rabbi Chanina, which I'm going to wait off on until we get to the end of the sugya, where he appears saying that we face Jerusalem. Okay, so again, until now, we've seen three opinions. First opinion, God's presence is in the west. Second opinion, which maybe is an opinion, maybe is just a counter to the proof of the first, maybe God's presence in the east, or maybe not. And the third one, which is definitely an opinion, that God's presence is everywhere. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says, "My daftiv ya'arof kamatar lekchi." We're now going to take this pasuk from Ha'azinu, the brachot, right, the poem at the end of, not the brachot, sorry, the poem at the end of the Shira, the song that Moshe sings at the end of Sefer Dvarim. Ya'arof kamatar lekchi. There's 4 parts to this pasuk. They're all talking about how God's word will come down to the people like rain. It will be like rain. Tizal katal marti. It will come down like dew, the word of God. Kisirim ale deshe. This is a little confusing what this means. Sirim are actually evil spirits that come up through the in the grass, and kirivivim ale esev, and like they help the grass to grow. Okay, so this is a very mostly beautiful analogy, although the Sirim is a little bit negative about the words of God. So now they're going to darshan, since there's 4 sections, they're going to connect this to the 4 winds. And again, we're going to learn about winds. This is the west wind that comes from the back of the world. Okay, perhaps they thought the west wind was a little bit dangerous, and maybe that's what it means. Rashi says, from the strength of the world. Okay, what to make of this? Good question. You have to also somewhat reconcile some of these different sources that seem a little contradictory. We said the north wind was good. It kind of tempered all the other winds. Here it seems to be saying the north wind dries everything out, and therefore it causes the price of gold to go down, because if there's no rain, the price of crops go up, which that causes price of the gold to go down, to devalue. So this is another pasuk that says hazalim zahav mikis, that it basically is going to cause the gold to go down, to be cheapened. Kesirim alei deshe, zo ruach mizrachit shemaseret et kol haolam kisail. Okay, the way the seirim were these evil spirits, these demons, so the ruach mizrachit causes a big stir, hullabaloo in the world. Okay, it's interesting. We talked before with the south wind. This one says it's the eastern wind. Kirivivim ale esev zoruach dramit shimale rivivim umegadelet asavin. Here it sounds like the south wind actually causes everything to grow, and it's a good wind. There clearly were different approaches about what these winds did. Now we're going to go into a braita that's going to talk about the fact that when the way they viewed the world, again, having the earth at the center of the world in their understanding, and the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, but when it traverses the earth in their viewpoint, it traverses the earth on the south side. It never really comes to the north side. The question is, what they're grappling with is, first of all, sometimes, okay, then there's winter and summer. And in the winter, it's more in the winter, first of all, it's much shorter, the days, and the sun is only visible for part of the time. Okay, and also it's in a different location in the summer and the winter, right? Sometimes closer to the north side, sometimes farther from the north side, even though it never comes to the north side. So there's a few issues they're grappling with in terms of what they saw in the world, and this sugya tries to explain it. Okay, I say tries to because it's hard to, first of all, their whole approach was definitely not what we believe to be the way it is today, or the way we understand it today. And also, right, they knew less than we did about it. And also, some people think that this whole sugya is allegorical, and it's really meant to talk about imperfection in the world, and not really to talk about what actually is going on in the constellations. So, or between the sun and the earth. So with that, we'll get started, and it will be a little bit confusing, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Rabbi Eliezer says, we're going to see a machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Olam la'achsadra hu domeh. The world is like a portico, which has 3 walls on 3 sides, and one side is open. We're now going to learn that the ruach tzfonit eina mesubevet, the side, now ruach doesn't mean wind here, it means direction. The direction of the north is not closed. Okay, so we basically have the portico is on 3 sides closed, on the east, west, and south, and on the north it's open. V'kevan shigia chama, it's a kerem aravit, tzfonit. So now the sun goes. Now we're going to explain why you never see the sun on the south side. Because when the sun goes from east to west on the southern part, okay, like around the south side, then it gets to the northern tip, right? It gets to the west on the northwest, and then it leaves. Okay, now it's all open there. So it can't go there. So what does it do? Because it's open. So it goes out, okay? Like leaves the atmosphere, you could say, sort of, but not exactly. Now, okay, let's just read again. As soon as it gets to the northwest corner at the end of the day, basically as the sun sets, now why don't you see the sun anymore? Well, this is also explaining why you don't see the sun at night. The sun goes out of Earth, away from Earth, when it gets to that open area, and it goes basically up above the firmament. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Olam lekuba hu domeh. What do you mean? It's closed on all four sides. V'ruach tzfonit mesubefet, and the side of the northern side is closed also. So now we have to explain if the sun's going in the walls, right? That's what we're assuming. It went in the walls, and when it got to that open area, it kind of had to go somewhere, so it goes up. But now we're going to say it goes in the walls. Well, then if it goes in the walls, then you should see it in the north also during the night. So what do they explain? When it gets that northwestern side, at the end of the day, when it sets, it leaves that closed-in area, goes outside, traverses the northern side, and then comes back in the morning on the east side. So it traverses that whole north side, okay, from like even northwest, right, going all the way around to the east again. Now, how do we know this? And they're going to explain some pasuk in Kohelet, in the beginning of Kohelet in the first chapter. Shenemar, holech el darom v'sovev el tzafon. It goes to the south, and then it goes around, like it traverses it. It goes outside to the north. Holech v'chulei. Holech el darom bayom v'sovev el tzafon balayla. So the holech el darom part, it goes to the south, goes by the south is during the day, and that's when you see the sun. And it goes by the north at night, and it goes again, sovev, it goes around and outside. Sovev, sovev, holech haruach, the pasuk continues, it goes around and around, double language. Ve'al svivotav shav haruach, and on its rotations, the wind comes back. So how do they explain this? What do they explain this to mean? Elu pnei mizrach u'pnei ma'arav, shepamim misavavtan u'pamim mahalachtan. This is the face of the west and the eastern side. This is like where they are. In other words, again, there's east to west, but there's northeast, northwest, right? So we have south, northwest, southwest, right? The west has part that traverses from the south to the north. So that's the Pnei Mizrach and the Pnei Ma'arav. Shapamim misabavtan. Sometimes in the winter months, it goes around that part outside. L'sovev again means outside, and you don't see it. Okay, that's in the winter months, because in the winter months, it doesn't even get to anywhere on the northern part, because it goes the short way. It goes from the south side, from east to west, and then immediately leaves. And then the longer, right, this is because the day is short. And then it has, right, if you imagine like as a circle, it's going around, it's doing an orbit. As it goes around the west, the panim of the west, and then the panim of the east, right, early in the morning and late at night, it's going around the west side of the north, or just even not late at night. That's the whole point. In the winter months, it's a long time. It's from 4 o'clock, depending on where you live, 5 o'clock, it's already out. The sun, it goes around and gets all the way back to the southern side, and only then comes back in with a late sunrise. That's when it's Sivavtan. Pa'amim mahalachtan. Sometimes the Pnei Mizrach and the Pnei Ma'arav, right, the part that's on the southern side going closer to the northern side of the west and the east, the sun actually travels inside and you see it, and that's at the long summer days. Okay, so now the braita continues. So we have these two approaches. Is the earth closed on 4 sides, and the sun just kind of leaves, and that's why we don't see it? And sometimes it does that short traverse, sometimes it does a longer traverse and gets more to the north during the daytime, so wherever there's a longer traverse in the day, there'll be a shorter traverse at night, or reverse. Or is it the first opinion, which is it's all open and just it leaves, right, and goes up into the heavens, okay, and then comes back down at night, and that in the morning. That's why you don't see it on that northern side. That northern side is fully open. That's why it has to go up to the heaven, above the firmament, and only comes down in the morning. And that's why we don't see the sun at night. Now they say Huaya Omer. The braita continues, and the Gemara stops us to tell you, oh, by the way, Atan the Rabbi Eliezer. We're back to Rabbi Eliezer, who thought that the north side was fully open, and he's going to show where he knows this from a pasuk that it's open. Min hacheder tavo sufa. It's a pasuk in Iyov. The sufa will come, the storm will come from the cheder, from the room. Zo ruach dromit. Okay, they explain this is the south side because the south side is the room. What does it mean it's the room? Well, it's got walls on all three sides because it's got the south side and it borders on the west and the east. So it's the innermost point is the south, whereas the north is all open and the west and the east are open on the north side and closed on the south side. So there are only like two walls. So the cheder is where the bad is going to come from, and that's the south. So that proves to you that the north is open. Umi mazarim kara. Okay, now this is a little unclear what this means. Zoroch tzfonit. Again, by the way, this thing that Rabbi Eliezer is saying is talking about the different strengths, right? This says the south is where the dangerous wind is going to come, which match one of the sources we saw, but not the other. Mimazarim kara. Rashi explains what does this mean. Shadochen muzeret uprusa. That the doorway, the wall is open and exposed. Okay, and here's again a proof that from the cheder, the inner part is the south, the outer part is the north, right? Then that's open. And okay, now what does it mean? Kara? Some people say it means the cold is going to come, but that's really difficult because the next line says cold. Okay, we're going to talk about kerach and for ice. But some people say it just means that it's open, and from there, I'll try to remember. Pawutz. I forgot the way they explain kara. They explain it some other way, but really meaning the key word is mazarim. It's pazur. It's open. Minishmat el yitain kerach zoruach ma'ravit. So the next part of that pasuk is the ice will come, and that comes from the west. V'rochav mayim b'mutzak, and the water will come. Zoruach mizrachit. That's where the water comes from the east. So now they just ask a side question about this. Didn't we say before, we now go back to that last source at the bottom of Amud Aleph, which said that the Ruach Dromit is good. Here it says the Ruach Dromit is bad. There's two different ways the rain can come from the south. It can either come in torrents or it could come gently. When it comes gentle, that's good, and it brings all the crops to grow. But when it comes in torrents, it's hazardous, dangerous, causes all sorts of problems, right? With all the global warming and weather issues, right? We understand this very well. I mean, I'm sure it went on then too. Amar Rav Chisda, my dechtiv mitzafon zahav yete. From the north, the zahav yete. We're going to explain what this means. Zeruach tzfonit shemazelet et zahav. Again, why the tzafon and the zahav? What's the connection? It means that the zahav will be decreased because of the north, because again, once the crops start going up in price, the gold is going to drop in price, in value. And then it quotes again this pasuk we saw before, that zalim will, in terms of cheapens the gold from our pockets. Amar from Bar Papa, Amar Rav Chisda, another statement quoted in the name of Rav Chisda, from the day the temple was destroyed. Lo hugshama ruach dromit. The Ruach Dromit doesn't bring rain anymore. Shneimah, vayigzor al yamin v'ra'ev. There's a pasuk from Yeshayahu that God is going to make a decree on the yamin. Said the yamin is the south, and there will be famine, meaning there won't be any rain. V'yochal asmo v'lo saveh, when they will eat on the left and they will not be satiated. Uchtiv tzafon v'yamin ata baratam. Now, how do we know yamin is south? Because it says tzafon and yamin. You built right ata baratam. You created both north and right. So right must be south because it's the opposite of north. But Amar from Bar Papa, Amar Rav Chisda, another statement that Rav brings in the name of Rav Papa, Rav Chisda. Sorry, third statement of Rav Chisda, but two by the name of Rav. We'll pass down by Rav. Miyom shachara Beit HaMikdash en shamim yordim me'otzar tov. From the time the temple was destroyed, no more rain comes from the good treasures of God's hands. We don't have any more good rain. All the rain is bad rain. Shneimah yiftach Hashem lachat otzara tov. So God will open up his good treasure. When the Jews do what God wants, and the Jews are living in the land of Israel, then the rain comes from the good place. But they learn from this pasuk that when the Jews don't do the way of God and they're not living in the land, then the rain doesn't come from the Otzar Tov. And since the temple was destroyed and people left Israel, they weren't getting good rains anymore. What exactly they mean by this is a good question. In Babylonia, there were good rains. Maybe what they meant, the land of Israel wasn't getting good rains, because the land of Israel always struggles with rain. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, harotzeh sheyakim yadrim. Now we're going to go back to, okay, we got kind of sidetracked with all these things about the winds and the different directions. And from there, we got to how the sun goes around the earth and their belief. Now we're going to go back to the issue of directions. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and particularly davening in that direction, although some people do understand the sugya to mean something a little different. If you want to be wise, yadrim, face the south when you pray. Some people think this means go to the chachamim in the south. In other words, it doesn't mean daven to God facing south. It means go find people in the south. They know how to teach you chokhmah, wisdom. Shiur, if you want to get wealthy, yetzpin, go to the north. Okay, so again, either it means pray toward the north if you want to get wealthy, pray toward the south if you want to get wise. It's a little bit of a strange thing. See in a minute that someone totally disagrees with this. V'simanech, and the way to remember this is shulchan b'tzafonu menorah b'darom, in the temple. The shulchan was in the north, and the shulchan represents the bread, which is the food, which is sustenance, which is money. The menorah, which is the light, which is representative of Torah, was in the south. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar le'olam yadrim. He disagrees and says you should always pray toward the south. Again, whether it means to pray or it means to go to the chachamim there, because if you get wise, then you'll also be wealthy. These are not two different talents to learn. These all go hand in hand. We say this at the Siyum every time, which is long life, longevity is in the right, meaning if you get what's in the right, which is in the south, which is the wisdom, bismola osher v'kavod, you will have in your left osher and kavod, meaning that will come hand in hand. One leads to the other. In other words, the wisdom leads to the wealth. But if we understand, especially if we understand the sugya to be saying, turn to the south to pray to God, which, by the way, we now have a fourth opinion. I forgot to mention this, right? We had west, east, maybe it was an opinion, we're not sure, everywhere, and now pray to the south, or maybe the north, depending on what you're looking for. So we now have all the possibilities. And how could Rabbi Yeshua say, well, do darom, when he said before, you should do ma'arav, so which is west. So Hamar Rav Yeshua ben Levi, the Shekhinah is b'ma'arav, to which they answered, the mitzadeh datstude. You face the west, but turn your head to the south. Amar le Rabbi Chanina le Rav Ashi. Here comes our opinion number 5. Rabbi Chanina says to Rav Ashi, Kegon atun diatvitu b'tzfona de'eretz Yisrael, adrimu adrimuye. You who are living, and you'll see why maybe this is 5, maybe it's part of 4. It says, you who are living in the north of Eretz Yisrael, which is Babylonia, it was actually northeast, but north, adrimu adrimuye. You should face south. In other words, maybe this whole south thing isn't a new opinion. Maybe it's opinion 4. And maybe opinion 5 is, we'll face Jerusalem. Okay? But what he's saying is, you who are living up north should be facing south. Okay? When you said south, you were talking to the people in Babylonia. Okay? But right, the Babel is Fonad Eretz Yisrael time and Dechtiv. How do we know that Babylonia is north of Israel? No, not because we looked at a map, but because Dechtiv mitzapon tipatach haral kol yoshvei haaretz. Very famous pasuk in Yirmiyahu, first chapter. Right, the bad is going to come from the north. So what do you see here? Babylonia is in the north. Now, so again, this could be just a playoff on the Darom. That the Darom wasn't because Darom specifically. Go south, pray south wherever you are. It just could be that they were in Babylonia and they were talking about south because that was for them, it was south. So that would then say either south is one and this is another, or maybe that's all one and the same, which is pray toward Israel. And that's again matching the sugya and brachot that we saw. Okay, getting back now to our Mishnah, we finally finished this long section. Marchikim et hamishra min hayarak. So now we have to say we're separating the flax that you're soaking from vegetables because all that liquid, the water there, all the moisture is going to ruin the crop. Tana Rabbi Yossi matir b'chardal. And then there was a braita that says Rabbi Yossi, right? The Mishna actually said Rabbi Yossi is matir b'chardal, but the braita says, the braita has a more extended version, which we saw when we were in Daf Yomi. She'achol amar lo ad sheta omer li archei kardecha min dvorai, archei dvorai min dvorecha min chadar. The reason why he matir said he permits it in chardal is because you could say, right, you're telling me move my mustard, but because it's bothering your bees, but your bees are bothering my mustard as well. So that's why you don't have to move the chardal. Because they eat my mustard seeds. New Mishnah. You might remember we had a whole discussion about that. What's this real disagreement with the rabbis? We had different interpretations. So the new Mishnah says you have to move a tree from a pit 25 cubits. In a carob or a sycamore tree, 50 because they have much longer, their roots extend much farther. Whether the tree is up and the bore is like the tree is up in a mountain and the bore is down in the ground in the valley, or the bore is up and the tree is down. We'll talk about this soon in the Gemara. Or bein minatzad, or if they're next to each other. Either which way, 50 cubits for those and 25 for a regular tree. Im habor kadma, and this we all saw already quoted in Daf Yomi. If the bore is first, kotzetz v'notein dami. So if the bore came first, we actually saw the continuation of this, but the bore was there first and then you planted your tree, you have to move your tree. But notein dami. So you can insist that they cut down the tree, but you have to give him the money back for it, the owner of the tree. It's a little strange. Why do you have to do that if they shouldn't have done it? But they say you have to compensate them because in the end, they're cutting it down for you. But if the tree was there first, you can't make the person of the tree, right, the owner of the tree, cut down their tree because they put it before you put your bore. Why'd you put your bore there if my tree was already there? Safek zekadam, what if we're not sure who put it first? Lo yakutz, we can't insist, one can't insist that the other one cut down their tree. Rabbi Yossi Omer, even if the bore was there first and then I planted my tree, right? We saw this also quoted. Lo yakotz, he's got the approach, everyone can do what they want on their own property, and you don't have to worry about the other person, and that's what we explained in the end, when we struggled to explain Rabbi Yossi exactly. The Rabbi Yossi thinks everyone can do what they want, and it's on the nizak, the one who's getting damaged, to move their issue, their item that's getting damaged. The Gemara starts off Tana by bringing up braita. Bein shabor lamata vilan lamala, bein shabor lamala vilan lamata. So now we want to understand this line. Bishlama, sorry, this isn't a braita, this was our Mishna. Bishlama bor lamata vilan lamala. I get if the bore is down and the tree is up because the roots grow down into the ground. It will get into the bore. Ka'azin shorashim matkele labor. So the roots go and damage the bore. Ela bor lamala, if the bore is up and the ilan is lamata and the ilan is below ground, amai, why would it be a problem? If the roots go down, 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 what are they going to affect? The pit. Amar Rabbi Chagai b'shem Rabbi Yossi mepnei shemachlidim et hakarka u'malkin karkiita shel bor. They cause the ground to rot, and eventually it will rot the underneath where the bore is, the bottom of the bore. Okay, even though the bore is up, but the bottom of the bore and underneath the bore can get ruined, and that will eventually ruin the bore. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Apa Pishi Ilan Shabor Kodem Lilan. We're now just quoting that line from the Gemara, the Mishnah. Even though the bore was there first before the tree, lo yikotz shezeh choper b'toch shelo v'zeh noter b'toch. So I plant my tree later. It's not my fault. I don't have to remove it. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name Shmuel, we pass on like Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rav Ashi kehaven beRav Kahana habamrina modi Rabbi Yossi begeri didei. But Rav Ashi says when I was with Rav Kahana, he told me that Rabbi Yossi admits though. He says in the case where I am directly causing you damage, if I pour water and my water streams right from my field into yours in a way that ruins it, that's direct damages. I'm responsible. So even though he says I can do whatever I want in my property, as long as I'm not directly damaging you. So geri delay, geri means arrows. It's like if I'm shooting a direct arrow at you, that I can't do. Papa Yonai Niva Shilhava. There was a guy, his name was Papa Yonai. He was poor and then he became wealthy. Bana Panda, he built a beautiful castle, palace. Hanach there were people in his village that were crushing sesame seeds. And his palace would shake every time they crushed their, right? They used the millstone, and the vibrations caused the walls of his palace to shake. So they went before Rav Ashi Amarle. He said to him, Rabbi Yossi said, right, he quotes this thing that Rav Kahana said, that if it's direct damage, and this is direct damage, because every time they use their millstone, it shakes your walls. And Bethekama, how much is considered damage? So they say, which Rashi explains, if there's a few different ways of understanding this. If you put a jug on the wall with a cover on it, and the cover starts shaking, then that, right, from the vibration, that is considered that it's damaging your wall, because if it shakes that much, right, that would shake the cover of your jug, then that's a sign that it's ruining your walls. And then it would be direct damage, and even Rabbi Yossi would agree. Okay, so quick review of today's daf. We started with things you have to distance from the city. What things could you put on what side of it? Smell, things with foul odors. Then we said, okay, well, Rabbi Akiva had this opinion not on the west, but every other direction you could. And then we had to try to figure out what was unique about the west, to which we said, oh, it's because the west is where God's presence is. There we got to all the different opinions about God's presence. From there, we got off on a tangent about the different directions of the winds. We had a whole bunch of things about the winds and the directions. And then we got into how they believe that the sun went around the earth, and why sometimes it's shorter days, sometimes longer days, why we see it during the day. We don't see the sun at night. Where does the sun go? Different approaches. Is the world 3 walls with 1 open side, or all the sides closed in, right? Whatever this means is very hard to understand. And there are some people who understand it allegorically. And then from there, we got to, and then we had all these different opinions about which direction you pray in. And then we finished with the other things that you have to distance from another, and some of the details regarding those cases in the Mishna. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom.